Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Science Buffs podcast, the ultimate podcast for STEM enthusiasts. My name's Abby.
And I'm Sam.
And we are starting a podcast. It's our first episode. We've been talking about it for a while, and we are doing it. So, Sam, let's talk a little bit about what to expect, what the people can expect from each episode.
Thanks, Abs. So each episode is going to start with life updates. Our favorite podcast start with life updates, and we enjoy hearing it, so we're going to give you those. But for each episode and each week, we have alternating weeks. Abby, for this week, is going to teach me about a STEM topic of her choosing. I have no idea what the topic is, but she's going to give me 3 clues and hints for me to essentially guess what the topic is. And then she's going to reveal her topic if I get it incorrect. And then she's going to go into why she chose this topic for this week and then do a deep dive into that topic. So we're educating each other along with educating you in this podcast. So all references that we've used will be in the show notes, so you can refer to for more detail if you want later on. But we look forward to learning with you guys.
Yeah, we are excited. So in lieu of life updates, because you don't know anything about us yet, we're just going to do like a little about me as the first section of this podcast. So, Sam, I'll throw it back to you. Let's give a little synopsis, a little about you for the listeners.
All right, so a little bit about us is Abby and I actually went to college together and we graduated in
Go
2018.
Buffs.
Go Buffs. So we have known each other now for about 10 years, which is kind of crazy to think about. We both got our undergraduates in aerospace engineering, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that in
You'll
future
probably hear about it
episodes.
in this episode, if I
Oh,
had to
okay.
guess.
See, does that count as a clue?
Yes, that is one of my clues.
Yeah, so Abby and I met in Calculus 3. We were both struggling and in office hours, and she had a background of Chris Pine from Star Trek on her computer. I'm a big Trekkie. We both love Chris Pine. The rest is history.
Yeah, I barely even like Star Trek. I had not watched it. I just love Chris Pine.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, it's fine. I like the movies, just not the TV shows. It's fine.
I think what I like about us is that although we have a lot in common, we're also very different. And I think that's definitely contributed to a healthy relationship between the two of us for the past 10 years.
For sure.
So a little bit about me is I'm 28. I had to think about how old I was. I I work as a full-time systems engineer. I really like it. I'm learning a lot in my new role that I'm in right now. In my personal life, I have 2 dogs that are the center of my world, and I'll probably talk about too much. Yeah, I have a 6-year-old golden retriever named Bernie for the Bernoulli equation, and a 4-year-old Great Dane Ranger. And they're the center of my world. They're my fur children, and I will be annoying about them.
I can't believe Ranger's 4. That's crazy.
No, it's crazy.
Nice.
In my free time, I love to Peloton, which I got Abby into as well. So
Yes.
follow us
We do
on the
all of our hobbies
leaderboard.
together now.
Yes, all of our hobbies are together like 2 old ladies. We'll end up in a nursing home together. But yeah, follow us on the leaderboard if you have a Peloton. We would love that. And
Yes.
then my other favorite thing to do is embroidery and cross stitching. It's really good anxiety reliever for me. So that's a little fun fact about me. All right, Abs, let's hear
Cool.
about you.
Well, you covered all the college stuff. We knew each other for a long time. I guess for my personal life, I have a husband, a son who's 4 months old. He's like so cute.
I'm an honorary auntie.
Yes. Auntie Sam has frequent visits, and I have a little orange cat who is crazy, and you might hear in the background just meowing through the door at some point.
Mickey Mouse.
Mickey Mouse, yes, his name is Mick. Let's see. I have really started getting into cooking. I like trying new recipes. I've tried to get into sourdough, and I keep trying to get into sourdough, and I've killed about 4 starters, so I keep having to get some from my aunts. But might talk about sourdough at some point. I've tried to garden, that was kind of a flop this year. So, I'm just trying to live off the land a little bit more as my as my major hobby. So yeah,
Homesteading.
homesteading. We're out here trying, but the garden did
We're
not
out here
succeed.
trying
So
homesteading.
so it's not
Hashtag we're out here
good.
trying.
Pretty much the extent of my homesteading has been like making jam. So I can do that.
Love it.
But yeah, that's pretty much about me. I've lived in Colorado like pretty much my whole life. And yeah, that's about it. So do you want to get into the topic?
Yes, I'm ready for my clues.
Okay. So you kind of touched on the first one already, that we learned about it in school. And my second clue was going to be, since it could cover any STEM topics like science, technology, engineering, or math, I tried to narrow it down to engineering related, but that's pretty broad. So I'm going to say it's like structures related, structural engineering.
Interesting. Okay.
Do you have any guesses after the first two clues?
Something we learned about in college in structural. Oh my gosh.
Okay, I'll give you the
I
third
don't
one.
I need a third clue.
Okay, it almost killed like a lot of people.
Oh. Wait, is it the Tacoma Bridge?
No, no, but that was a good one.
Oh, that's
Good
just a
guess, good
classic
guess.
structure. Okay. Well, a lot of people. Um,
Specifically, a lot of people in Manhattan, it almost killed.
oh, wasn't there a building that they didn't design correctly? And then
Yes,
because of the wind shear, it was gonna like collapse or something?
yes, you have guessed the
Woo!
topic. So
And
it is
wait, what
called
was it
the
called?
Citicorp Center Engineering Crisis. So the building is called the
Okay.
Citicorp Center. And yes, so it is a building that basically almost collapsed and they had to make all these repairs, but we'll go into more detail about it. So let's talk about why I chose this topic, because I
That's
feel like
yeah.
I have discovered what my Roman Empire is. Like it's this. I realize I think about this like probably once a week. So, um it's crazy because okay, just going throughout my everyday life, I'm always like a little bit skeptical after hearing this story because I'm always like, oh, everything's safe, like we have regulations. It's fine. Like this building's safe, this bridge is safe. After I learned about this in college, I'm like, nothing's safe. Like everything could just be a lie. And you will understand why here. So yeah, that's why I chose it, just because it stuck with me ever since the college class when he's like, yeah, everything, this almost collapsed. Basically, it almost wiped out like 18 blocks, they said, of Manhattan, or 10 blocks of Manhattan. It was a very near miss. So
What year was this again?
this was 1978, but
Okay,
they kept it a
so
secret for about 20 years. So it was kind of crazy. So do you remember why it was like structurally unsound, not sound?
I remember the potential cause for it collapsing. I don't remember what like the design flaw, but I do remember that they didn't account for how fast the winds go in between the buildings, correct, in Manhattan?
Not quite between them, but just like on the building. Okay, so here's the story. So basically, this guy, there were two guys. One was an architect named Hugh Stubbins, and then there was a structural engineer named William Lemessurier, which I will probably mispronounce. I might just call him
That's
William.
impressive.
I'm gonna call him William. Okay.
Okay.
So Hugh and William, they were contracted to build this building. Also, my screen went very yellow, and I do not know really why. I look really yellow right now.
I'm just going with it.
But it's okay. We're still working out the kinks here. It's fine, guys. So anyway, Hugh and William were contracted to build this building. It was, let's see, on 53rd Street and Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. Now, the problem was there was this protected church called St. Peter's Lutheran Church that took up a corner of the building lot that they could build in, and it was considered like a historic site, so they weren't allowed to touch the building, but they could build in the airspace above the building.
Oh, that's
So
right. Okay, it's coming
William
back to me.
Lemessurier was out for like breakfast, and he was thinking like, how can we build this skyscraper and also protect the church because it takes a corner of what we're supposed to be building a corner of the space we're supposed to be using. So he came up with the idea to build the building on stilts. Now, when you think of stilts, where would you think that the stilts should go on the building to make it most structurally sound?
The corners.
Yes. But he couldn't do that because of this building, this church that needed to be protected. It would have gone right where the church was. So he came up with this design where he would put the stilts in the center of each side of the building. So each corner was basically free hanging.
Interesting.
And we'll post a picture on the Instagram, I'm sure, when we publish this episode. But so go look over there. But yeah, so there were stilts that were 9 stories tall that were in the middle of each side of the building. So it looked pretty sketchy. Like you look at it and it doesn't look like a structurally sound building at all.
Do you know what they were made of? Were they just like solid concrete?
That's a good question. I don't know, but the rest of the building, the reason why it's such like an innovative design is because instead of pillars, like usually if it were to be on stilts, it would just be pillars running all the way up through the whole building, like very, heavy pillars that would keep the
Right.
building strong. But William came up with this chevron design. So it was these V's that would be stacked on top of each other. Each one was 8 stories. And so it would be like these big triangle designs. And so since he didn't have the pillars, it was a really, really lightweight building compared to a normal building this size. It was 59 stories. And so it was really light. So because it was so light, it would sway in the wind. And like to an alarming amount, like people working in the building would be freaked out. So they added something called a tuned mass damper. I don't know if you remember, I didn't remember this part in school, but it's a big part into the eventual almost collapse of this. There's this tuned mass damper, and basically it was like a 400-ton like weight, essentially like counterweight. So if the building started swaying, this would start countering the swaying. And it was powered by electricity, which is an important thing. It wasn't like a mechanical device. It was powered. It was a powered device to keep it from swaying.
Interesting.
So it was a completely novel design, but he did all the, well, I guess it's debatable whether he did all of the required calculations, but he did the required calculations and it looked fine. Okay, so then in 1978, like this all got constructed. Well, I guess it got constructed probably a couple years before then. I should fact check that.
Wait, so
But
I have a question really quick.
yes.
So they did all the required calculations that were acceptable for the time. Like it's not like he was knew that he was cutting corners or anything.
Well, I read some articles that there was some debate about him cutting corners, but yes, he followed all of the required calculations to put up a skyscraper in New York.
Got it. Okay.
Now, there's some debate about whether he should have done some more because I guess this kind of architectural or structural standard was to do a few more than what was required, but he did like the bare minimum. So,
Gotcha. Okay.
so all of this, another important thing is that basically the main part of this, like why he thought it was so strong and everything he based his calculations off of was based on that the joints of the chevrons were going to be these welded joints. So like these big plates were going to be welded. And anyway, so that's what he assumed happened. He designed it with these welded joints, and then the building went up and he thought everything was fine. So this would be like the scariest call of your life. But in 1978, there was an undergrad architecture student. Actually, wait, let me see. Okay, sorry, I had to reference my notes. But actually, in 1978, it was a grad student at Princeton University who was studying the Citicorp design or the Citicorp Center's design for her thesis. And because it was such a novel design, she was gonna like go through all the structural things and like calculate all the numbers and put it as her thesis. And as she's analyzing the design, she's like, this is not right. I'm not getting the same numbers for these stresses as what the firm published. So she's like, this is seeming wrong. So
First of all, if that was us, I would have just assumed that I did something
I
incorrectly.
know. Well, she kind of did, I feel like, because she brought it to her professor, and her professor and her both went to the firm and said, we're not getting the same numbers as you. And basically what the firm did is just say, like, like you're fine. They kind of just said, it's not gonna blow over. Like, you've done the stresses wrong and the building can stand.
Did they
That's at
have
least what
like a
I read.
margin of did they have like a margin of safety? Was it like in the
Yes,
margin of
there
safety?
was the firm. Actually, funny you mentioned that because I wasn't exactly sure what this meant, but there was like I guess a 1 to 2 or 2 to 1. There was a margin of safety that they were supposed to use. And William, I was going to try to say his last name again, but I'll skip
I'm impressed, honestly.
it. William thought that they were using the standard of like 2 to 1 margin of safety. Turns out later the firm actually used a 1 to 1. So when they dismissed her, they said like it's not going to blow over. We're within the margin of safety, and they were talking about 2 different margins of safety. So she was the first one that kind of raised concerns, and she just said like, "Hey, I got this reply back from the firm," and so she just documented it in her thesis. But she was like, "I didn't get those same numbers, but here's my thesis," and they said it was fine. Okay, so that's the first thing. Then an undergrad student also called him and said, "Hey, this isn't looking good. This can blow over." So basically, you're right with the winds. So how they usually calculate the max force of a building is by calculating the winds that would hit perpendicular to the side of the building, like the face of the building, because it's the most surface area that you're going to hit, and that seems like seems logical that would be the most force. However, with this building, since it was on stilts in the middle of each side, they didn't realize that the strongest force was actually going to be when they hit the quartering winds. So like at a 45-degree angle. So that was like a major, major problem for the building. Now, that would not have been an issue by itself. Like it was higher stress than what they thought, but it wasn't going to blow over the building anytime soon. Like that wouldn't have been the only issue. It would have been a miss, but not super dangerous. Well, at the same time, this is where it gets bad. At the same time, William was designing a similar building in Pittsburgh, and their contracting company had a question about the bolt or the weld joints because they said like, why are we doing these weld joints? They're a lot more expensive than these bolted joints. Do you think we could switch them out? And William was like, huh, that's interesting that you bring that up because it would be more expensive. I wonder how the old contractors did this, like how they got the cost down, or it was like, oh, something's kind of weird because we didn't have a huge cost and whatever. So he calls the old contractors that he worked with or the construction company that he worked with to build Citicorp. And that guy tells him, oh, we switched out the welds for these bolted joints because it was way cheaper. And in a normal building, this would have been fine. Like if you were just looking, and this was like the big lesson of our class. I don't know if you remember the lesson, but it was like, hey, you got to look at the big picture because in this like isolated engineering swap like decision, it looked like a really good swap. You're saving money and it can withhold the same amount of force, basically. But because the whole thing is built on these angles and the chevron building structure, this having these bolted ones were like, this is what really put it over the edge. So neither one of these problems would have been an issue, but it was like the fact that they both happened at the same time, they didn't take into account the quartering winds, and they switched out the bolts.
Yeah, they didn't use like systems thinking principles.
Right. So, and no one told him, like no one flowed the information up to William that this swap was even happening. So he was going to keep on designing these buildings with the same bolts, and they were going to presumably keep switching them out because it was a good engineering decision to swap them in theory without knowing the design of the whole building. So yes, basically because of the chevron design, each joint would have a 40% increase in wind loads from what they thought. and there was 160% increase in total load at the bolted joint. So if winds came that were 70 miles an hour, the building would totally blow over.
It's
So
terrifying.
then he went to another firm and they did some more like real life simulations with a wind tunnel, and they realized probably the more accurate number was about 55 miles an hour. So
So even
eventually
worse.
eventually they realized that about every 16 years there was a storm big enough in New York that would blow this building over. And so
And it
it's just
had
like a
been
ticking time
sitting.
bomb. It had
How
been
long
sitting
had
for
it?
probably only a couple of years. It was a pretty new building, but yeah. So like every year it had basically a 1/16th chance of just completely blowing over, which would have been obviously very very bad. So I got a fact wrong. So I reread. Basically, when just with the winds and the bolted joints, uh, every 55 years was the storm that would collapse the building. But then there was a whole other thing with the damped tuner or the damper. Why did I say tuner? Tuned mass damper, I think it's called. Basically, since it was run on power and it needed electricity, if a storm came, the electricity was probably going to go out. So
Right.
that made the damper not work at all. So that's where the 16 years comes in, because much lower winds would blow it over if the damper was not working, since it was so light. So that's where we get
Got
to
it.
the 16 years. So he thought it was like, okay, he's like, okay, it has to be a 70-mile-an-hour wind. Oh, wait, actually, it has to be a 55-mile-an-hour wind. Oh, wait, that's if the damper is turned on. If the damper is not turned on, it's going over. So anyway, so do you remember what the professor told us in college at this point in this story? Like what William did when he found out that this was an issue?
I don't remember. Was it funny?
Well, I mean, not really, but like the way he presented it was kind of funny, where he's like, okay, so he went up to his home in Maine and he figured out what he was going to do. So he contemplated just never telling anyone, like just let it collapse at some point. Like, oh, I had no idea. Then he briefly contemplated killing himself. But then he figured he should go back and fix it. Like the professor said it in like this, just such a nonchalant way. But like then I
So
read these articles that
why
yes,
would he not tell anybody, just because of pride, or like would he lose a lot of
I
money,
think, well, it was like
reputation?
his reputation was going to get ruined and he would probably lose like his engineering license, because he was like a principal, or principal engineer. And so yeah, it was a lot of reputation and ego, and like he was like, what are the chances it just won't fall down? Maybe we're wrong, that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, he was like very torn up about it. He was like, I don't want to be responsible for killing all these people, so maybe anyway, he eventually decided to go back and try to fix it. So it was a crazy repair process, and this is like basically no, the public was not aware of this for 20 years. It was kept under wraps because he did not want to cause widespread panic in
Did
New
they
York.
still have people working in the building? Because it was an office building, right?
Yeah, it was an office building, so they had people working in the building every day. So he's like, well, if I tell everyone, then they're just gonna like not want to go in the building. Everyone in the area is gonna is gonna be panicking. Like we're just gonna cause chaos if we tell everyone. So I don't know how this was kept a secret for 20 years. And this is what makes me skeptical of a lot of things, because people say like, oh, if a lot of people are in on something, someone's gonna tell. Well, the public was not made aware of this for 20 years, but listen to how many people were like kind of in on what was going on.
Did they have to
So
sign like an NDA or something?
it didn't mention any NDAs, but
Hmm.
I don't know. I'm sure more people maybe knew, but the public at large did not. And it's kind of an interesting thing. What's the word? Like merging of events. I don't. There's a word for that, but so basically, the newspapers were on strike. All three major newspapers in New York happened to be on strike while this was happening, so no articles were written about these repairs that they were going to do. So that's part of the reason why the public didn't know. But basically, so he went back and he worked with City Core for emergency repairs. So the way they were going to repair these is weld plates over the bolted joints to make them, to basically reinforce them. And with that, even though they didn't take into account the winds, the quartering winds, it would withstand a lot more stress. And so they needed to like go fix pretty much all of these bolted joints and weld plates on them, but they couldn't do it with anyone knowing that it was a structural issue.
I feel like if you
So
were working in the building and you're walking in there every day and you see people doing this,
yeah, so that's the
generally people would
thing.
at least ask, like,
Yeah, so
what do you
that's the
think that they're
thing.
doing?
How they kept it under wraps basically is people didn't know that there was construction going on, but they even kind of kept that under wraps. Like, so they would wait till people went home and do all the repairs overnight so they wouldn't disturb anyone in the buildings. And from what I can tell, they knew there was construction. They just played it off as like a minor repair. They didn't say it was like a structural thing where they were literally going in and reinforcing structural joints. They just said, oh, you know, we have some like touch ups basically. They just kind of downplayed the importance of the repairs. So they did this every
Which
single
me, if I
night.
was working there, I'd be like, this is a relatively new building. It's kind of
Right.
concerning that they
Right.
seem to be
I feel like
making large
I would
changes.
ask no questions, honestly. I'd be like, well, okay, well, whatever. But yeah, you're right. It's
Hindsight,
a new
yeah.
building. And I feel like I would have been the one that's just like 20 years later, like, what? I worked in that building.
They have a degree, so it must
Yeah,
be okay.
literally. Yeah. So they went in every night, like cut drywall, went in, welded these things on, put it back up, and they said, oh, we have some touch-ups. Well, at the same time, they were working on, you know, with like the emergency services in the city to work on an evacuation plan that spanned a 10 block radius around the building. So all of the like police and firemen and things were aware that this was a problem and they were working on evacuation plans in case a wind storm or like a hurricane was going to come and wipe out the building. So they knew. And then there were 2,500 Red Cross volunteers on standby at any given point to make sure that they could help execute this evacuation plan. Weather services were alerted in New York 24/7 to make sure there were no winds coming that, you know, where they had to like say, okay, the evacuation plan is being put in motion, start evacuating. So weather services knew, and yet the public never knew. It was never published in an article, partly because of the strike, and partly because they did it, you know, at night. They hired crews to kind of keep it on the down low. So it's crazy.
I hope
Like,
this resulted in some type of legislation or
yeah,
something.
I think they check quartering wins now. I don't know.
Oh my gosh.
So
So
then
they
they
eventually had
also,
to find out, right?
yeah, so they eventually, well, so then they also brought in emergency generators for the damper specifically, so that in case winds came and knocked out the power, that at least the damper could still work, and so the chances of it blowing over would be minimized. So that was like a practical fix before the construction was done. But then this is kind of spooky. 6 weeks into the construction, so it was halfway done, there was a hurricane that was heading straight for New York. And they
Oh
were
my
like,
gosh.
oh no, like they were not done with reinforcements and it still probably would have blown over with how strong the hurricane was looking. So everyone was on high alert. They were monitoring the situation. And then pretty much at the last minute, it turned eastward and avoided New York. So they, you know, it was like a very, very close call.
And the people in the building still had no idea that this was a risk at all.
Correct. Yeah. So they were like, oh, a hurricane's coming. Like,
You think that like somebody in the weather center or like at the Red
would
Cross would
leak it.
have or like know somebody is like that works in that building, even if it's like, oh, I think
Right.
my neighbor's sibling works in that building. We should probably
Right.
do they
So I
know? But
don't,
maybe they assumed
but
that they knew of their risk.
there were also no cell phones. And so it would have had to just
That's
gone
true.
by word of mouth or the newspaper, which was not printing.
That's true.
So interesting. This was a pretty long strike by the newspapers, repairs were completed in October. So they started in like June or maybe July because they found it in June. Um, they ended in October. They finished in October, and that entire time the newspapers still were not printing. So they literally got done with the entirety of the repairs. They played it off as minor fixes to the building, and it was never reported that this was a structural error. And basically part of it too was that they actively lied to the public. Like the mayor, I think it was the mayor, went on and said like, yep, they're just making some minor adjustments to the Citicorp Center. It's not structural. Like there are quotes of people saying like it's not a structural problem.
Do you think that this was primarily for PR or do you think
I think it was just
they
because
didn't
like
want
if
to
you were
cause
in New
panic?
York, yeah, I think it was the panic. Because if you were in New York and they're like, hey, this skyscraper you live next to could collapse if there's enough wind,
So
I would panic.
did the contractor designer make other buildings within New York?
Not with this design. So it didn't have the same issues. Like the
But
real,
I could see
yeah.
like if this same contractor had other skyscrapers buildings in New York, then yeah, keeping it under wraps to prevent a widespread panic
Oh,
would make
oh,
sense.
right. Yeah.
But if it's
Yeah, I'm not
like this is
sure.
a one-off building,
Right.
he
I
hasn't
think
done anything else.
yeah, I'm assuming that the contractor had painted other buildings in New York. So it was probably all part of it. Like if you knew the building design, you would know that it's only really an issue for this building, but like people would panic that all their
Yeah.
buildings are bad, you know. So yeah, they didn't want to cause panic, but it's still crazy. Like they like lied to everyone, and then all these people kept it hush hush, even though they had all these emergency plans. So it was pretty crazy. But they finished it. They redid all of the stress calculations and all that stuff, and they found that basically after the repairs, there would only be a wind or a storm that is strong enough that could topple it every 700 years instead of every 16. So I think we're safe for
Do
the
you know
near
what the
future.
average is for like, or the
The wind.
standard is for, well,
Oh,
for like a skyscraper
I
in
don't,
New York City? Like it has to be
I
able to
think
withstand.
I'm assuming they got it to the threshold. So I think 1 in 700 is probably around standard, but I don't know. We need a producer that will Google this as we go.
Yeah, we do.
Maybe a fact check section. Anyway, so this brings up as you I don't know if we were on air when we mentioned, but this was brought up in our ethics class, like in an engineering ethics class. So this brings up a lot of ethics points. And so I'm going to read this snippet of an article that I found that I thought was interesting because it says, according to the American Institute of Architecture Trust case study, many have viewed the actions of Le Mesurier as nearly heroic, and many engineering schools and ethics educators now use his story as an example of how to act ethically. So basically, like if you find that you've done something engineering related that is wrong, they're like, look at he came forward and showed everyone that it was wrong and went and fixed it. Oh, and by the way, him and Hugh, I don't the architect covered all repair costs, which was like millions of dollars
Wow.
in the 70s. Um, so even though he like lost a ton of money and stuff and his reputation, he came forward. So many people use this as like the golden standard of ethics. It says, however, others have criticized his lack of oversight that led to the issues and his lack of honesty towards neighborhood residents, architects, engineers, and other members of the public when the problems were discovered. It says
Do you feel
architect.
like,
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I was gonna say, do you feel like the lack of honesty was in his control though? It seems like it might not have been in his control
Probably
as
not. I
far
mean, I'm
as,
sure the mayor didn't want it to go out. Like, if public
yeah,
officials are speaking out about it and not being completely honest, like, I don't think it was all in his control. I think they had
yeah.
meetings with the legislators and stuff. So, but this brings up, so there were 6 key ethics points that this brings up. So one of them was the analysis of the wind loads. So this says that in his initial plans, he relied only on calculations required by building codes rather than checking all calculations. So that's a gray
Okay.
area for sure, because like if you can build it, like he checked technically what he had to check. but
Yeah.
he should have checked more, basically, is what they're arguing. Which I don't know. I feel like the reason part of that is because of this different design. Like probably with a normal building, those only the calculations required by building codes are probably fine. Like the perpendicular winds are usually the strongest stresses. So
Yeah, and you would
maybe it was just an
assume.
oversight about like how this is a different uh structure and how that changes the stresses on the joints and stuff. So, but some people argue that like he knew that he should probably do more calculations and he didn't. So that was interesting. Design changes. So the builders, like we mentioned, made a quick decision to use bolted joints without consulting the chief engineer, which is considered an ethical oversight. Like again, like you were mentioning, not systems level thinking. They just went ahead and switched them. So
Right.
then personal responsibility, it says before William decided to make City Court aware of the design defects, he briefly considered concealing the issues instead. I do not feel like this is bad. Like, I don't think this is an ethics thing. I think everyone would consider every option. You know, like it says he
Yeah.
briefly considered it. Like he didn't wait years. He waited like a couple days.
Yeah. I feel like
And
he
he knew
was
a
the
storm
typical
wasn't coming in
engineer.
those couple days.
Yeah.
Like if
I
you
think
make
he
a
was a
big,
typical
yeah.
engineer and assessed all sides of his options that he had
Yeah, and if
available.
you know
And
your
he
career
made
is
it.
going to basically be over, I think you're going to consider like for a brief minute just lying about it.
It's human nature.
Yeah, but then he decided not to, so I think it's fine. But that is raised as a key ethics point. Public statements, it says in interviews and press releases at the time, officials either omitted or lied about details of the defects. So again, not to create panic, but that does bring up an ethical question of like, do you have a responsibility to tell the public? Public safety, when Hurricane Ella threatened the city in August and September, evacuation plans were made in secret in 1978. So should they have let the public know about evacuation plans? Because what if it had actually happened and they needed to evacuate and this is like the first time the public is hearing about this? I feel like that would
Exactly.
even be more chaotic.
It'd be not
Um,
be an effective plan. And I think when
yeah,
lives are at risk and you have the information to provide to people to make their own decision whether or not they want to take a risk with their life by
right.
continuing to work in that building, then you have an ethical
Yeah.
responsibility to inform them.
I feel like the I feel like the concealing, and maybe this is wrong, maybe I'm unethical, but I feel like the concealing could be argued that it could be ethical up until they knew about the hurricane. And then the hurricane was coming and they still didn't tell. And then they just were lucky that it turned. Like,
Yeah.
at what point were they actually going to tell the public, like, you got to evacuate when it was right on top of them?
Yeah, that's a poor evacuation
That's
plan.
that's what seems bad is like, I understand not telling the public until if you know that there's no winds coming. But once you see that hurricane coming, you should probably tell people. And they didn't,
Yep.
they still didn't. So, and then advancement of professional knowledge is the sixth ethics point, which is basically like because they concealed this problem, they concealed it for 20 years almost. It came out in 1995 that this was an issue publicly. And some people argue that because they concealed it for 20 years, there was a lot of engineering learning that could have taken place, because of this that was not learned, and that is inherently unethical to cover up.
I agree with that one.
Yeah. So maybe they could have just like, let the public know right after it was safe.
Yeah.
Like, hey, it was dangerous, but now it's safe. They
I
could
feel
have
like
not waited 20
they'd be,
years.
I feel like at that point they would be at risk for a lawsuit. It could be because I've been
Yeah,
watching
so
Suits a lot, but
oh yeah.
but I
We should talk
but
about
I feel
Suits.
like if you work in this building and then you're informed that hey, you could have died, but it's all good now,
Yeah,
I would
that's
be pretty
true.
mad.
Especially during the hurricane. So that's probably why they waited a long time. But
Yeah.
20 years seems like too long when, yeah, like, because that lesson has stuck with me a lot, like to not do a seemingly good swap or a seemingly good engineering solution without consulting about how that will affect the rest of the system. Like that is a very poignant lesson that probably should
Well, I
have been
think that
taught to people for like the 20 years, that it was covered up.
I think that's something inherently wrong with like what we call the waterfall method of
Yeah.
engineering, which luckily I think most people in industry are moving away from. But yeah, I mean, that was repeated with the Challenger, and there's other incidents that we learned of in college in that ethics class about people not informing other people about potential consequences to the decisions that they're making on their one small
Well,
piece that they're
yeah.
responsible for.
Well, and that's why I thought that it was so interesting with the grad student who first brought up the quartering winds, because she was kind of like, she didn't really fight it that much. Her professor didn't really fight it that much. They like basically just documented it and kind of moved on. But I guess part of that was also that they didn't know um the bolts were switched out, or like the joints were switched out. So like this article mentioned, it's like neither one of these individual issues would have been a problem. It's the fact that they found out that both were happening at the same time that made it like super dangerous. So,
That's like, isn't that when we started talking about the Swiss cheese model of failure analysis, where it's like essentially if you line up different pieces of Swiss
oh,
cheese, and then
yes,
if like two potentially bad things or two holes in the
right.
Swiss cheese line up, then that can be a catastrophic failure.
Oh yeah, I totally forgot about that. But yes, it's ringing some bells for sure.
The Swiss cheese
Yeah,
model.
and same thing. Yeah, same thing with the Challenger. Like it wouldn't have been, the cold wouldn't have been a problem or something. There was like two failures that led to it, and then no one could get their voice heard up the chain. So I'm actually impressed that like this undergrad student was just able to call the chief engineer of this building and say like you have a serious problem, and he eventually listened. So
Yeah.
I'm,
Well,
I'm
that's why
glad
our
they were
professor,
persistent.
do you remember our professor used to always say, never take off your engineering hat? Like
Yeah,
you can put on your human hat, but
right.
you always need to leave your engineering hat on.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So that is the City Core Center engineering crisis.
your Roman Empire.
My
I
Roman
loved it.
Empire.
I feel like I
Yes.
needed to dust some cobwebs off. That was in the depths of my memory.
Yeah, yeah. I had to like really refresh on the details because I was like, it was something with bolts and joints, and all I remember was that they like made these secret repairs like in the middle of the night, and I was always fascinated by how they could possibly do that.
Oh, does
So
that building still exist?
yeah, it
Is it
does,
still
and so does the
standing?
church. Yeah, you
Well,
can
I
go
think
see
we got
it.
to take a trip to go see that. This
I know we have a lot to
science
do in New
buffs
York.
trip.
In New York, we got to do a live Peloton class, and then we'll go swing
Yes.
by the City Core Center, take a
Yes, the City Core
picture,
Center.
and yeah, that'll be our science buffs um, road trip. Well, no, not road trip. We're flying. Let's be real.
Yeah, we have to fly.
Not road
We're
tripping to New
bougie
York.
like that.
We're bougie. Anyway, that is all for this week's episode. So make sure you follow us on any platform that you are listening to us, and leave us a review, please, because we are trying to get the reviews up. It helps with the algorithm. So we would really appreciate if you did that. Follow us on
And subscribe.
YouTube, subscribe, review, do all the stuff, and follow us on Instagram, Science Buffs Pod on Instagram, and we'll post all the updates there, just some fun other stuff. And whenever our episodes drop every Wednesday. So be on the lookout. And we hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next week. Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
bye.